Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Montessori Thrive's Leadership Town Hall. We do these every Thursday throughout the school year. We have different topics and different speakers. Today, we have Heather White with us to talk about supporting neurodivergent students in the Montessori classroom. And please feel free to use the chat or you can unmute yourself and talk to us. We want to have an active, lively discussion. So, with that, I will turn it over to Heather.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here with you today and having you join me for this session as we explore how Montessori pedagogy and philosophy can be helpful in supporting some of the diverse learners in our classrooms. I've been with Montessori Thrive a couple of times before in their parenting series, but I'm super excited to be here to talk to some folks in the schools and get to know a little bit more about you. So that's actually where we're going to begin. If you feel comfortable, if you're in a place where you're able to do so, I'd love for you to drop in the chat where you're joining from, what your role is. Are you a classroom guide? Are you a school leader? Maybe you're here and you're also a parent or caregiver, so maybe you have multiple roles. And then also, if you're in a school, what type of school are you working in? Is it public, private, charter? This just helps give me a little bit of insight on maybe what some of your experiences have been with supporting diverse learners and maybe in what capacities you've done that work in the past. So we'll give just a couple minutes here and see if anyone's able to drop some details in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll share a little bit about myself. So as I see the responses come into the chat, we'll review those. But just so you get to know me a little bit better as well, my name is Heather White. I am a former Montessori classroom teacher, administrator, and in-home caregiver with nearly 2 decades of experience in the world of Montessori. I feel like knowing a little bit more about my professional background helps give you a sense of what informs my perspective on this topic, and also some of the various influences that are going to underlie our session today. Before I dive in a little more, I do see a response here in the chat. Lakeview Montessori School, a private school from infant to grade 8 in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And role is admissions and preschool coordinator. Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Christina. Thank you for the work that you do. And Julie and I were just chatting before you all joined about different temperatures and how cold it is in different places. And so I am giving you a nod here from sunshiny Florida that's also cold because I can't imagine what it must be like in Ontario as well. I know it gets very cold there. We also have another response here in the chat from Zion Montessori School, both guides. And Unetta, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, is also a director in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, I was there last year for a Montessori conference. My husband and I had a lot of fun, lots of cool things to see and do there. Thank you for both for being here. And then Dolores is a head of school at Northwood Montessori, a nonprofit AMI school in Houston that serves children 18 months to 6 years. Dolores is primary trained and has been in the classroom for 20 years until she stepped out last year. Well, thank you for being here, Dolores. It looks like we have a mix here of people from all over, different roles. And I think that'll be wonderful as we dive in. As I was sharing, I'll bring my background and my perspective, right, from the roles that I've held. And I would love for you all to share in the chat as we go along. There'll be times where I'll ask some questions for you to share your thoughts, ask and share your comments. But if anything kind of strikes you or sparks your interest, or you have some sort of experience or insight to share, I would love for you to do that as well. It looked like we had one more come through in the chat from Kristen, Valley Montessori School in Livermore, California, the student support coordinator, and they have children toddler through 8th grade. Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Kristen. So a little bit more about my background to give you some additional insight. So currently I'm working as an educational coach. I work in multiple roles with the Center for Guided Montessori Studies, including as their alumni conference, webinar, and professional development coordinator. I'm the coaching team leader, accreditation associate, but my favorite roles are working as an instructional guide, practicum advisor, and field consultant, where I have the opportunity to support adult learners who are working to receive their Montessori credential. I'm also an adjunct professor and the director of academic projects at Sarasota University, which is the only MACD accredited institution of higher education dedicated solely to Montessori. We like to call ourselves the Montessori University. And on top of all of that, I enjoy developing content and writing blogs. In the past, I've written for several organizations, including the American Montessori Society, Guide and Grow, and Miro's Toys. I have my Montessori credentials from the American Montessori Society at the 3 to 6 and 6 to 9 levels, and also have experience working with children from birth all the way through 18. I have a master's degree in education with a concentration in Montessori studies, an education specialist degree in school psychology, and I'm currently pursuing a doctorate in EDD in Montessori as well. I have an anti-bias, anti-racist certificate from AMS, and I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist. So I feel and hope that my background, both in Montessori and in school psychology, gives me a unique perspective to bring here today to this topic. We had one more come in the chat from Elizabeth. Elizabeth's at Montessori Children's Schoolhouse in Pittsburgh, a small privately owned school with one toddler and 2 primary classrooms. Again, a nice addition to the experience and background we have here. Thank you for being here. All right, so before we go any further, I'd like you to take a moment to share your thoughts with me. And there are no wrong answers here. There's no single correct answer. It's just what you know, just your current understanding. So if you're able to, in the chat, type your response to this question. What is neurodivergence? When you hear that, what does that mean? It could be a definition, maybe some characteristics that you might see in the classroom or in your work with children, perhaps even other adults that you know. But when you think of that word neurodivergence, what does that mean to you, or what comes to mind? And it might be you don't know, and that's okay too. You can share that in the chat. That's why we're here, right? We're all here to learn and grow. Christina says how a child processes information and then expresses it. Absolutely. There's that, the way the brain, right? That's the neuro piece, the way the brain is involved in the way a child thinks, the way that they behave. So absolutely, that is a big piece of it. Keep sharing in the chat as things come to mind or if you feel comfortable. And we're going to explore kind of the background to neurodivergence from a more scholarly perspective, right? So formerly considered a problem or something abnormal, scientists are now thinking about neurodivergence in a more positive light, realizing that it can have many benefits. Being neurodivergent isn't a disability, but rather it's just a difference in how the brain works. And with this shift, practitioners, much like you and I, right, as guides and leaders, are no longer treating neurodivergence as an illness or something to overcome. Instead, we're viewing it as different methods of learning and, as Christina shared, different ways of processing information. Neurodiversity, so we've been talking about neurodivergence, right? Neurodiversity is this overarching idea, it's really a model, that it is normal and acceptable for people to have brains that function differently from one another. So rather than thinking that something is wrong or problematic when some people don't operate similarly to others, neurodiversity really embraces all differences. This concept recognizes that brain function and behavioral traits are just indicators of how diverse our entire human population is. So it's really seen as a beautiful thing to embrace. We can break neurodiversity down into two categories, those who are neurotypical and those who are neurodivergent. And there's even been some more work in this particular area of the definition because people believe that separating it into these two categories of what's typical still leads you to believe, well, that's normal, so then neurodivergent must be abnormal. So really it's seen, we like to see it as this diverse range, right, that embraces the spectrum of brain development and behavior rather than the categories. But really, this is where the research still is today. So then when we use the term neurodivergence or neurodivergent, what we're talking about is when someone's brain processes, learns, and or behaves differently from what we consider typical. I mean, I'm going to put that in air quotes as I did on the slide here because there really isn't a typical way, right? We're kind of sending some of our own biases or prejudices when we say that. So just kind of keep that in mind. There are many different ways that neurodivergence can manifest itself, from what you might refer to as a very mild presentation, things that some people might not even notice, to more obvious ways that might lead a person to behave differently than what we might consider standard or acceptable in our society. So a lot of this, the idea of neurodivergence, comes back to our cultural norms and societal norms as well. On the other hand, as I'm sure you can assume, neurotypical is the term that we use to describe someone whose brain processes, learns, and or behaves in a way that we would consider typical. So we can call these neurotypical people. And again, my belief is there really isn't anyone that's neurotypical, because what is typical or what is normal? If all of our brains are different, then how do we say someone's brain is behaving in a typical way? But something we can look for is that these individuals hit all of their developmental or behavioral milestones at the same time or around the same time and age that's considered standard. So with that in mind, if you feel comfortable, I'd love for you to share in the chat now what types of neurodivergence that you've seen in your schools or in your classrooms. This might be ADHD, autism, dyslexia, maybe anxiety, giftedness, sensory processing challenges, emotional regulation. There are so many, right? These are just some examples to get your ideas flowing. So just pop a couple in the chat of things that you have seen in the children you've worked with or supported. Christina says all of those. We have some ASD, so autism spectrum disorder, autism and anxiety, Kristen says. Pretty typical, right? We do see quite a bit of autism and ADHD in school-age children. Dyslexia, Dolores adds another that does come up quite a bit. So as we move through the presentation, and I'm glad those are some of the ones that you're seeing and maybe looking for ideas of how to support children with those diagnoses, because we're going to hone in and focus on just a couple. And amongst the ones that we'll focus on are those that you've noted. Okay, so as I was saying, these are the areas that we'll focus in on. Because this idea of neurodivergence really has grown to encompass so many different ways that the brains work, there are many different ways that neurodivergence can manifest itself. These are some of the most common examples, which are those that you've mentioned. The first is autism, which is a neurological and developmental condition that's known as a spectrum because it can prevent from mild presentations to severe. Autism spectrum disorder is also known as ASD, or autism for short, and it can affect someone's behavior and emotions, and it includes a really broad set of conditions that might include challenges with socialization or social skills, Um, Children may exhibit, or individuals, because it can present itself in adults as well, repetitive behaviors, restricted interests, which we've now come to refer to as special interests, so something that there is a really great fascination with, and then also speech and language challenges. ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is an executive function dysregulation disorder, which means that individuals have difficulty managing their thoughts, their attention, their behavior, and their emotions. People with ADHD might have difficulty with things like organization. They might feel restless. They might be hyperactive. They might have challenges with focus, initiating or completing a task, and might also show what we would consider a socially inappropriate behavior when they experience really strong emotions. Dyslexia is a form of neurodivergence that involves speaking, reading, and writing. It's typically associated with misreading, misspeaking, or miswriting words or letters out of order, but it actually encompasses a lot more than that. For example, it might involve confusion with certain letters. It might be difficulty ordering words into sentences, trouble acquiring vocabulary or pronouncing words correctly. And it may also include challenges with following directions. Down syndrome is the last one here that we'll focus in on. And this is a condition in which a person has an extra chromosome. This extra chromosome alters the development of the child's body and their brain, which leads to some challenges both mentally and physically. People with Down syndrome typically have an IQ in the mild to moderately low range, and some common physical features like a flattened face, almond-shaped eyes, a short neck, and also typically poor muscle tone. Some other types of neurodivergence that we didn't mention are things like Tourette syndrome, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, epilepsy, things like bipolar disorder, mental health challenges, anxiety, depression. All of these things fall under the category of neurodivergence. So now we're going to get into some of those strategies, right? What helps us as Montessorians to support children who have these types of neurodivergences? So again, from your experience, just so I kind of get a feel of where everyone comes to this space today from, what elements of the Montessori philosophy or pedagogy do you believe or have you seen be supportive for diverse learners or for neurodivergent learners in your communities? Anything at all that you've seen are pieces of our Montessori system that support diverse learners. We have the ability to follow the child, yes, taking into account their interests or setting a pace that works for them, right? Rather than needing to stick to specific benchmarks. Kristen says hands-on materials. Yes, that ability for things to be really concrete, that connection Dr. Montessori talked about between the hand and the brain. You all have highlighted some of the many unique benefits of Montessori education for neurodivergent students and really diverse learners of all kinds. As some of you noted, the Montessori materials and the Montessori environment are helpful really for any child, but neurodivergent students in particular may uniquely benefit from our learning spaces because they naturally address some of their challenges. There are so many aspects of the pedagogy that really harness the potential to benefit diverse learners. And some of them include a minimalist design that's really common in most Montessori classrooms, right? It not only is there because it adds visual appeal, but it also really encourages simplicity over stimulation, which helps neurodivergent students often feel less anxious or less frustrated, which can come about when they're attempting to absorb too much stimuli at one time. Think about something as simple as that change from fluorescent lighting, right? That constant hum and that brightness that comes with fluorescent lighting, And switching to more natural, soothing lighting sources. You see a lot of Montessori classrooms have quite a bit of natural light flooding in from windows, or there's this soothing dim light from lamps filling the space. So even something is that seems that simple can really be helpful for neurodivergent learners. The freedom of movement that occurs in a Montessori classroom is also really vital for students who have various sensory or movement needs. As we were discussing, those Montessori materials are carefully designed to isolate single skills and include that element of self-correction, which makes it easier for students to focus and remain on task. In more traditional settings, activities might include several steps that require a teacher to provide guidance to neurodivergent students in order for them to navigate them successfully. And that, again, may lead to some feelings of anxiety, frustration, discouragement. And the students in Montessori classrooms have a really unique perspective because of the community that exists there, right? We really focus on creating a sense of trust and belonging. And so students don't typically view their neurodivergent classmates as different from them. We have this multi-age nature of our classrooms and also the individualized approach, right? That idea of following the child that allows each child to explore their own needs and interests and to be accepted in the community. So when there's such a wide range of learning happening at such a wide range of paces, right, that comes along with the individualized instruction and the multi-age classroom, neurodivergent students begin to fit in and blend in because there is this variety rather than standing out as someone who's very different. I did see a comment come in the chat here. Dolores added that the 3-year cycle allows for that deeper connection between the adult and the child. Absolutely. It is important to mention, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the multi-age classroom, but it is important to take a moment and mention that despite these inherent benefits of a Montessori environment, Montessori philosophy and pedagogy, that additional assistance from the guide and other support staff, both inside and outside of the classroom, might be necessary to help diverse learners experience the greatest level of success. And we'll come back to that idea at the end as well, but just keep that in mind. Montessori has so many benefits and additional support may be necessary. Elizabeth adds care of self and care of the environment, repetition, and modeling are all helpful for individuals with Down syndrome. Absolutely. So we'll look at this idea of the multi-age classroom, right? Research really strongly supports this Montessori hallmark. It's a unique facet that not only allows younger children to learn from older students, but also provides neurodivergent students with learning opportunities as they observe their neurotypical classmates navigate different academic and social situations. It's that modeling we were just talking about, right? It's actually required by law that neurodivergent students are placed in what's known as the least restrictive environment. This is a legal term that comes from the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, that serves as a principle for deciding the classroom placement that best meets the needs of a neurodivergent student. It shares that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities should be educated with children who are not disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment should only take place when supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And what that means is we shouldn't be focusing on removing these children from our environments. Rather, we should be focused on keeping them in traditional learning spaces to the extent appropriate or possible, because there is so much beneficial learning that's happening by being exposed to and in community with their same age and different age peers, which is, again, a unique benefit of Montessori. So including neurodivergent students and really all diverse learners in Montessori classrooms is not only special because of their learning from peers, but it also gives really meaningful learning opportunities to those what we might refer to as neurotypical students or the other children in the classroom because they start to learn what it means to be inclusive and accepting, right? It also mirrors what happens in the real world. So it's real life experience because, as we all know, in work settings, in community settings, individuals are working and socializing with people of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all dispositions, right? And so it gives them that opportunity to really support, accept, and understand what it means to coexist in a really beautiful, diverse community. And that's true for a neurodivergent student and neurotypical students. All right, so let's dive a little more deeply into those categories of neurodivergence we were talking about earlier to really see how we can best support these students. We're going to start with autism. Again, just some information there that's a repeat from what we were talking about earlier as far as what autism or ASD is. You might see those challenges with social communication, those special interests, those repetitive behaviors, and parents and caregivers, or maybe even pediatricians, might recognize early signs of autism as soon as or as early as the child is 1 year old, maybe even earlier. But sometimes the challenges that we see might not be apparent until a child starts school, right? When we start to compare them with their peers. So it might be us as the educators that first notice some of these challenges. The social communication piece in particular might include challenges responding to someone's own emotions or the emotions of others. They might avoid eye contact. There might be really scripted speech. They might interpret things very literally and have trouble with figurative language. And then also sometimes challenges with reciprocal conversations. Those special interests and repetitive behaviors might include things like inflexibility, challenges with coping with change, being really focused on niche subjects, maybe a sensory hypersensitivity, right, to light, to sounds, to taste, to the way things feel. And then stereotypical movements sometimes occur as well, things like hand flapping or rocking. And there have also sometimes been situations where children enjoy arranging things, ordering things, lining them up in a really particular manner. Just a note there that every time you see that, it doesn't mean that a child is on the spectrum, autism spectrum, because this is all could also be characteristic, especially for young children, of a sensitive period for order, right? So you want to look for challenges in all of these areas rather than just that one observation that you're making. In a classroom in particular, students with autism might have trouble communicating effectively with their peers or with classroom guides. They might have challenges with things like organization, time management, memory, right? Working memory, emotional regulation. And this can make it difficult for them to do things like initiating tasks, starting works on their own, prioritizing different work, as particularly at the elementary level, coping with mistakes, right? And they also may become overly stimulated. So we want to think about the sensory supports and the sensory stimulation that is part of our environments. So these are some strategies that you can use to support autistic students in the Montessori classroom. And a lot of these, hopefully, we're doing already, right? We don't need to overcomplicate things. We really just need to rely on our Montessori roots in some regards. So the first is to be warm, encouraging, and positive. Although I hope we always exhibit these qualities as the prepared adult, it's really imperative that these feelings are made clear to students with autism, especially when they're feeling discouraged or frustrated. We want to make sure we're acknowledging and validating their feelings, that we're encouraging them, and that we're providing that encouragement in the form of specific observations, because this can be motivating for children on the spectrum, allowing them to reach their full potential. We also want to make sure we're allowing sensory and movement breaks during the work period. Freedom of movement, as we talked about, is a natural part of the Montessori classroom. But it's important to encourage students with autism to listen to their bodies, help them understand those cues so that they can initiate taking breaks when they feel like they're needed or when they're having difficulty focusing, whether that's in between lessons or works or maybe even in the middle. If they just need to take a pause and step away for a sensory break or a movement break, we want to empower them to know when that's necessary and to do so. Um, we might want to think about incorporating different opportunities for autistic students to receive additional sensory input. Just as they may experience sensory overload, sometimes they need additional sensory stimulation. So things like jumping on a trampoline, things we call heavy work, right? That give that deep proprioceptive input. So maybe that's carrying a heavy watering can to water classroom plants. Think about things like that in the space that you can introduce to students who might need them and then guide them gently in that direction if you see they might be needing that sort of sensory stimulation. Um, Oh, a great question here in the chat. What's an example of a good movement break outside of the line work? So I love that you mentioned that, right? Because all of the walking on a line activities, whether you expand that with carrying something, ringing holding a bell and trying not to ring it. So it's very um, careful, coordinated movement. But I've seen some really beautiful spaces that have a movement shelf. And on this movement shelf, you might have things like a yoga mat with some yoga cards to encourage yoga poses. You might have things like a weighted ball that children can lift and then drop to the ground and lift and drop to the ground. Obviously, you want to be mindful of the other students in the space that might be sensory overload for. So where might this occur? Might you have an outdoor environment that these things could be accessed in? Another that I've seen that's pretty simple that can be effective for children who need that deep proprioceptive input is called hands on the wall. So just having little outlines of hands on the wall that they can go over. And it really is just showing them you put your hands on the print and push as hard as you can, right? I've seen other classrooms have wobble boards. So it sits on their movement shelf and children can take it out and you could stand on it, sit on it, and kind of rock back and forth. Is that helpful? Okay, perfect. And then the last support here is about task initiation and redirection. So it might be helpful, particularly in an elementary classroom. I found that it can support students to set out their first work of the day, right? Have all the materials that they'll need, a pencil, their notebook. Let's say they were going to do stamp game edition. The stamp game is there. All of the things are ready to go the afternoon before. I like to involve students in that process. So after we cleaned up the day before, I asked that student, could you go pick out what you want to do first tomorrow? The first thing you want to do when you come in and set it up at the workspace where you'd like to sit. And that was really helpful because in that arrival time when things can be a little unsettling, there's a lot of transitions happening, and it can be hard to start a task, right? We're setting them up for success by having everything they need there in one place. And they already know coming into the classroom where they can go and that everything is there that they need. You can also, for older students, have a list of necessary supplies that they might need to gather, or maybe a short checklist of steps if there's a task that's multi-stepped for them to complete. And Chat GPT, for those of you who are eager to explore it or have already started to use it, and other kinds of generative AI can be really helpful for this. I've explored it a little bit for things like racks and tubes or the stamp game. A lot of math works, right? That tend to the checkerboard that tend to have a lot of steps and be challenging for children who might have trouble with these multi-step and need more redirection. it gives them in very simple terms what each step of the process is, because this allows them to just kind of move through and check it off without needing you there to kind of give them that prompt or redirect them back to focus. We can also provide these types of redirections ourselves, and it doesn't have to be something really distracting or that calls attention to the child as far as the other students go. It might just be gently placing your hand on the child's shoulder as you walk by. Maybe you have a little nonverbal cue that you can give them, like a thumbs up or a wink, right? You can decide that, bring the child in and help them figure out what they want the signal to be. And you can give that to them from across the room. And it's kind of without using any words, a statement to them to help them remember, oh, okay, yeah, I was working on something, and kind of cues them back in to redirect. Some other strategies that can be helpful to support students with autism are providing prompts for transitions and changes in routine. Like I was saying, that morning arrival time can be challenging because there's so much transition going on. So we can provide them prompts to prepare them before those types of transitions happen. It might be a verbal reminder, something like, when you finish that work, it's time to clean up to get ready to go home. Or it could be something more time-based, right? Like in 5 minutes, while you're pointing to the clock and showing them what that looks like for a child who can't yet tell time, in 5 minutes, it will be time to go to lunch. A lot of people find it helpful to use what's known as a time timer or a visual timer, something that the child can see the time decreasing. And so they know how much time is left. They start to feel it in their body, right? Even before they're able to tell time. And just like it's important to provide those prompts for transitions, we also want to let them know when there'll be changes to what is their typical routine. So if you have a guest coming in for a special lesson, or if recess is happening earlier in the day, explaining those changes before they happen, maybe that first thing that morning, the day before, and then providing them a couple of reminders before that change happens. Using a visual schedule can be really helpful with this, so you can refer back to it and it's always there for them to look at. In my classroom, when I was an elementary guide, I wrote the schedule on a little whiteboard that was up on the wall. All of the children were reading, so they were able to use that. If you're in a classroom with younger students, you might want to rely more on a picture schedule, right? And going over that in the morning, again, focusing on those changes. We might also need to help students with autism with organizational skills. So we can provide them some support by recommending a system that helps keep them organized. It might be a special location in the classroom where they can keep a small basket that they can bring to their workspace that has all of the items that they need, like a notebook, a pencil, marker, scissors. For larger projects or assignments, especially for those older students, breaking it down into smaller steps can be helpful. Again, this is giving them those skills so that they are able to stay focused. And then finally, really placing emphasis on those grace and courtesy lessons that we present. So we do this naturally, right? We're always presenting them, particularly in the primary classroom, and I hope and the older levels as well, because it's still very much needed. But things like taking a turn in a conversation, respecting personal space, how to maintain eye contact. And I want to, and a caution isn't the right word, but just kind of, give you a little word of advice that maybe those things aren't always necessary, right? Think about cultural norms and maybe what's expected, but what isn't necessarily needed always, right? Do I have to look at you to tell you that I'm focusing? Whether that's in a lesson or in a conversation, we want to respect where children and really individuals of all backgrounds are coming from, right? So in my opinion, it's more important that they're able to carry on a reciprocal conversation, wait for their turn, and listen to the other person, and not necessarily that they're making eye contact while that's happening. So just something to consider there. All right, so let's shift our focus now to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. This is one of the most common types of neurodivergence affecting children. It's estimated that 8.4% of children have ADHD, Characteristically, it's more common among boys than girls, but that's likely because there's more noticeable outwardly presenting behaviors that boys are demonstrating than girls. In order to receive a diagnosis of ADHD, a child has to be experiencing, or I should say a person, right? Because this is the diagnostic criteria for individuals of all ages. But you need to be experiencing a real difficulty in at least two settings. So for children, that would be at school and at home. It needs to be generalized, and it needs to be happening for a period of at least 6 months. There are three different types of ADHD. ADD, which was a former diagnosis, no longer exists. Now we have ADHD inattentive type, ADHD hyperactive impulsive type, and then ADHD combined type. So common symptoms for that inattentive type are things like difficulty remaining focused or on task, problems with organization, distractibility, lack of attention to detail. Common symptoms for the hyperactive impulsive type will be things like fidgeting, difficulty remaining seated, frequent movement, constant talking, a lack of impulse control. And then combined type really is a mix of symptoms from each of those other two types. So here are 6 ways that we can support these students in our Montessori classrooms. What you'll notice, hopefully, is that there's a lot of overlap from the strategies for how we support autistic students. And really, that's because what is good for one child is good for all children. So really, these strategies can be used generally, right, with all of the students in our classroom. It's just that we have research to support that they really help neurodivergent students in particular. So again, keep that in mind that these things can be used with everyone in your spaces, but can be particularly helpful for those diverse learners that you have. So I'm going to skip over, just for sake of time and repetition circumstances, right? I'm going to skip over those that remain constant, things like providing warmth and encouragement, allowing those sensory and movement breaks, supporting with task initiation and redirection, right? We covered these with how we support autistic students, and all of the strategies remain the same. There's some overlap here as well with the providing prompts for transition and changes. But what I'm hoping that you'll gather is, again, that what works for a neurodivergent student, regardless of the category, will support all students. And what I want to do is focus in on that new strategy that you see, which is allowing self-pacing. As we all know, when we were talking about following the child, the Montessori method naturally encourages allowing the time and space for children to set their own pace for learning. If we apply that principle to working with and supporting children with ADHD, it means we're giving them the freedom to take the time that they need to get acclimated to a work or to a project. And that by doing so, we're eliminating the frustration that's likely to arise when they feel rushed. It's also important to give them extended time, especially if they're having trouble concentrating. So if you're in an environment where standardized testing might take place, or even if you're thinking about bigger work, right, that great work that we talk about elementary students and adolescents doing, we want to make sure that we're giving them a little more time than we might typically expect or might typically give to a student of their same age, so that they don't become discouraged or frustrated. And I personally think it's really important to start involving them in those conversations, helping them plan their time, see how much time is passing when they're working on something, just so they start to develop an understanding of the concept of time, the passage of time, because that helps them learn to self-redirect. And ultimately, we want to empower them to be able to do these things and embrace these strategies on their own, right? We're always thinking about how we help them become more independent with these skills. So as I said earlier, Down syndrome is a condition where a person has an extra chromosome. Typically, we're born with 46 chromosomes, but an individual with Down syndrome has an extra copy of one of those chromosomes, chromosome 21. And that extra chromosome can alter the brain and body development in the ways we discussed previously. Down syndrome can also affect learning abilities in many ways. So, that mild to moderate intellectual impairment might cause delays in speech, delays in motor skills, small muscle activities, things like handwriting will likely be affected. Most children with Down syndrome will have some challenges with short term or working memory, which might make it more difficult for them to access, understand, or process information at the same speed of other children their same age. And students with Down syndrome might also have some difficulties with those care of self activities, things like dressing and grooming. So these are 6 ways that we can support students with Down syndrome in the Montessori classroom. Again, you'll recognize some overlap, so we're going to key in on those new strategies. And one of those is providing opportunities for students with Down syndrome to serve as social skills role models. Students with Down syndrome, or people with Down syndrome in general, typically have really great social skills. So we want to use that strength to allow children to become role models or leaders for their peers in regards to socialization. That can give them a really powerful boost of confidence and an opportunity to truly shine. And again, this is something we do naturally in our Montessori classrooms, is find out what children are really great at, right? What are their strengths? What are their interests? And encourage them to become leaders in that area. So we're doing the same thing, but just with regards to what is typically a strength of individuals with Down syndrome. It's also important that we place a really strong emphasis on visual learning. And this can be challenging sometimes for us in Montessori spaces because we have been prepared to create spaces that have less visual input, right, to minimize those sensory overstimulations. So we want to look for situations in which we can provide visual aids. And I encourage you to think outside the box from just things we might put on the wall, right? It could be things like demonstrations, pictures that accompany works on the shelf, maybe even illustrations that go along with written materials that are available for children to access. All of these things can help students with Down syndrome to understand and process information. So, the other thing to keep in mind here, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It helps with providing those transition prompts, is a visual schedule. So this is kind of a two-pronged support, right? Because it does help reduce some of that anxiety and frustration for children for whom changes in routine or transitions can be challenging, but it can also be supportive for students with Down syndrome who need some more of those visual reminders or those visual emphasis. At the elementary level, if you have a written schedule, you might want to also think about ways you can incorporate those pictures alongside it, because that's really what we're looking to include are those picture supports. Some other ways that we can support students with Down syndrome is by providing individual motivation. Although intrinsic motivation is really a hallmark of Montessori, we want to take the time to foster a sense of motivation for students with Down syndrome. And I would expand that to say all neurodivergent students, because I think this is really crucial to helping them remain engaged and motivated and positive and joyful with their learning, right? So find ways that you can acknowledge their work and encourage them in a way that feels natural and authentic. And again, this is part of a lot of our Montessori backgrounds and our Montessori training programs, is not to praise, but to encourage, right? So highlight things that you've noticed they've done. I'm just going to give an example because I see the pink tower here on my screen. You might say something like, wow, I see that you stacked each cube of the pink tower. I see all 10 cubes stacked. Wow. So I'm not praising, right? I'm not saying, good job, way to go, even you did it. I'm providing this very specific encouragement that feels very natural and authentic. And then finally, ensuring that proper supports are in place in the prepared environment. We want to think about those physical supports as well, because for students with Down syndrome and other physical challenges, I might need ways that we alter the physical space, right? How we prepare the physical space. So we want to think about things like ensuring that there's a choice of workspaces with tables that are the appropriate height. And what I mean by that is we want the children's feet to be able to lay flat on the floor. If children's feet are dangling or they're not fully able to reach, it can cause muscle fatigue and muscle strain. And so that's really important for all children, but particularly for children who have these physical needs. Providing something for a child to lean against to ensure their back is supported is also important. When students with Down syndrome are working on the floor, it gives them that physical stability and that muscle support. How does the adult prepare oneself to guide in the primary environment with a 50% neurodivergent population? That is a great question. And I think what we're seeing is more and more students coming to us that are neurodivergent. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. I think it's we are diagnosing more often. I think we're getting better in the medical community, right, of recognizing signs and signals. We're also, I think, I'm hesitant to say this, but I think in some capacities we've become a little label happy, right? And everybody's getting a diagnosis. And so I think that's part of it. But I also think the other piece is a lot of families are looking for another option. And when a traditional setting didn't work, and a lot of times some of that is bringing them to Montessori, right, as an alternative approach to education. And so I think that for those reasons, we are seeing an uptick in the number of students in our classroom that have diverse needs. So to answer your question of how do you respond to that, I really think that I think it's a need in the Montessori community to adjust our Montessori credential programs and the professional development and mentorship that we provide Montessori guides and leaders. I think that it's actually part of my dissertation research that I'm working on right now is assessing that. But I personally believe that that is an area where we don't provide enough support or understanding of how to work with students with diverse needs. And when you're in the moment, I think that the best thing that you can do is try to gain more knowledge, right? So coming to different professional development sessions like this one so that you can continue to educate yourself and recognizing that you can't do it all. And I'm sure that's not the advice that you wanted to hear, right? But really, and again, this is my humble opinion. It's reiterated in the work of other Montessorians who have a background in supporting neurodivergent students and students with diverse needs that we really can't function as guides in supporting all of these students well, right? And do it well unless we have the support of outside services. Children who need occupational therapists, speech language pathology support, students who might need a counselor to speak to, students who might need reading intervention, things like the Wilson program or Orton Gillingham, right? We can't do all of that. And so I think it's really important that we have this team-based approach. I just finished reading a book by Mira Debs and I'm probably going to say the title wrong, so I apologize, but I believe it was Diverse Families, Desirable Schools. And she talks about this team-based approach. And as I was reading it, I really just felt like somebody else gets it, right? And is saying the exact same thing. But she gives a model of a school. She references a couple of different schools in her text. But she gives a model of one specific school that uses that framework where it's a classroom guide and this entire support staff that work together to support neurodivergent students or diverse learners and how powerful and successful that is. So I recognize that we can't all push for systems change, right? Whether that's the Montessori credential level or bring on all of these support staff into our classrooms. But I think the more we can encourage that, right, and speak up and say, you know, I really feel like we need additional support, or I really feel like this child needs something that I'm not able to provide, because I think that's an important part of our role as um, the prepared adult, as the role of the guide, right? Is to acknowledge when a child needs something. That's what we're there for, is to meet the child's needs. And so if we're not able to do that, advocating for that child to be able to get that support, I think is our duty, right? That's why we're there. That's what we stepped into and agreed to as the Montessori guide. And some of those conversations can be really uncomfortable with heads of school, with families. Um, and if you're looking for support for that, I highly recommend Kathy Perlman's chapter in the book Montessori Inclusion. I was just looking again, so I didn't say the title wrong. Great recommendations of how to navigate those challenging conversations when you think a child might need some outside support. All right, I recognize we only have just a few more minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly. I'm not going to read through a lot of the information about dyslexia. We talked a little bit about what that might look like, right? Some things like learning new words slowly, problems forming words correctly, reading below grade level, difficulty understanding directions. So these are the ways that we can support students who have dyslexia. Again, a lot of repetition here. We're going to hone in on the differences, the providing that extended time. We might need to give these children extra time to process questions, to gather their thoughts before they respond. They might speak slowly or even too fast, so giving them time without interrupting them so that they can really express themselves fully. We can also provide them additional time for assignments because they might need a little more time to understand directions or process the material fully. We want to give them alternative methods of assessment in lieu of asking them to speak out publicly or demonstrate knowledge of content in that way. We want to look for ways that they feel more confident. So if you need to call on a student with a language disorder, giving them time to prepare beforehand so that they feel confident and capable. Again, this should come very naturally in Montessori because we're all often creating alternative ways to measure students' knowledge and understanding, but just keeping that in mind. Breaking down large projects or complicated instructions is really important. We can spend a few minutes with students one-on-one to review directions or to break assignments down into smaller parts. Have students write directions in their own words or draw pictures to help them remember later. And then providing limited choices. Again, something we sometimes typically do as Montessorians, particularly with very young children, but instead of asking open-ended questions to facilitate problem solving, it's probably better to give some limited choices. So instead of asking, what work would you like to do next? You can ask something like, would you like to do a language work or a math work now? Or even more narrow than that, just two examples of very specific works. Do you want to do the stamp game or the checkerboard? I always go back to math examples. I'm not sure why. This touches on what we were just discussing, that we need to acknowledge there are times when outside support will likely be necessary and is really our duty to advocate for that. So students with Down syndrome will likely need occupational therapy to strengthen their muscles and develop fine and gross motor skills. Students with language disorders like dyslexia will likely need speech and language therapy or reading intervention. Students with autism or ADHD might benefit from counseling or social skills groups, helping them to regulate their strong emotions and navigate those peer relationships. These are some of the resources I mentioned previously. Mira Debs is not on there. This book here, Montessori Inclusion, is where I mentioned Kathy Perlman's chapter is on navigating those challenging conversations. But each of these books really has some great information. Pam Shank's book is pretty new, has loads, hundreds of really practical strategies for supporting students, much like the ones we discussed today. and things that I had never heard. It was very eye-opening for me, and I wish I was still in the classroom to try them myself. So some great ideas for future learning as well. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you guys hanging in there and actively engaging in the chat, asking questions. And I will stop my share so that I can see you all now.
Thank you, Heather. Does anyone have any questions? I know we're right at, for me, it's 1:30, but if you have to go, that's okay. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now.
And if anything comes up, I'm going to drop, I know I switched the screen off maybe before anyone got it. So I'm just going to add my email to the chat. Um, if you have any questions that come up, I know I threw a lot at you in a short period of time. So if you're thinking about something, or maybe one of those questions like we went through in the session today, like how do I support this particular student in my classroom, please feel free to email me. You can follow me on LinkedIn. You can look for me on social media. And I'm more than happy to help support you in any way that I can. Thank you, Dolores. I'm glad you were here.
Well, thank you, Heather. That was so informative, and I hope people really took some practical strategies away to use in their own Montessori environment. Next week, we have something we touched on earlier, actually. We're talking about navigating difficult conversations with parents without burning bridges. We'll have Joanne Shango with us for that. And this YouTube recording will be up tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Heather. Again, so informative.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor. And thank you all for being here and for doing this really important work that you're doing as Montessori guides and leaders.
All right. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you next week.